Thank you for listening to the Sleepy Mind channel. All chocolate begins with a living plant that grows quietly in warm, shaded places, long before it is mixed with sugar, milk, or heat. The cacao plant is where the story actually starts, rooted in soil, shaped by climate, and guided by time rather than speed. Tonight, this story follows the cacao plant itself, beginning with what it is, how it grows, and why its natural form determines everything that comes later. The focus stays with the plant, its physical structure, and the conditions it needs in order to survive and produce cacao. The cacao plant is the true starting point of chocolate. Before any processing takes place, before roasting or grinding, the raw material comes from a tree that grows slowly and responds carefully to its environment. The plant produces seeds that eventually become cacao beans, but those seeds only exist because the tree is healthy enough to grow, flower, and form pods over many years. Without the plant itself, there is no flavor to develop and nothing to transform. The scientific name of the cacao plant is Theobroma cacao. Theobroma comes from Greek words meaning food of the gods. This name reflects how the plant was viewed by the cultures that first cultivated it. The name does not describe sweetness or indulgence. Instead, it reflects value, rarity, and importance. The plant was recognized as something that required care and patience, and its harvest was treated with attention rather than excess. Cacao plants are evergreen, meaning they keep their leaves throughout the year. Instead of shedding all their foliage in one season, they replace older leaves gradually as new ones grow. This constant presence of leaves allows the plant to continue photosynthesis without interruption. It also means the tree maintains a steady demand for water and nutrients, rather than cycling through long periods of rest. The leaves are broad and smooth, shaped to collect filtered light rather than harsh direct sun. Because the cacao plant keeps its leaves year-round, its internal systems remain active across seasons. Water continues to move upward from the soil. Sugars produced in the leaves continue to travel through the trunk and branches. Growth happens in small, continuous steps rather than sudden bursts. This steady pace supports long-term health and reduces stress on the plant's tissues. In wild forest environments, cacao plants can grow into small trees that rise over 40 feet tall. When left undisturbed, the tree develops a central trunk with branches that stretch upward and outward through layers of surrounding vegetation. Height allows the plant to reach gentle light, filtered through taller trees, while remaining part of the lower forest structure. Growth happens slowly, shaped by competition and shade rather than speed. A tall, wild cacao tree spends much of its energy building strength into its trunk and branches. Wood thickens gradually. Leaves spread across wide spaces. Flowers and pods appear closer to the main structure rather than thin outer limbs. This form supports longevity, allowing the tree to survive for decades without collapsing under its own weight. On farms, cacao plants are kept much shorter. Instead of reaching their full natural height, they are pruned regularly so that pods remain within reach of workers. Shorter trees reduce strain on the trunk and lower the risk of branches breaking under the weight of developing pods. They also allow harvesting to be done carefully by hand, without climbing or heavy equipment. Keeping cacao trees small changes how energy is distributed inside the plant. Rather than sending resources upward into height, the tree directs more nutrients into lateral growth, leaf maintenance, and pod development. Branches grow thicker and stronger close to the trunk. Pods form at manageable heights, where they can be monitored and protected. This managed height also improves visibility. Farmers can see signs of disease, insect damage, or water stress earlier when the tree is compact. Air moves more freely through the canopy. Light reaches leaves evenly instead of being blocked by excessive vertical growth. These conditions support healthier trees over longer periods of time. Even with pruning, cacao plants do not tolerate harsh control. Cuts must be made carefully to avoid damaging the trunk. Removing too much growth at once weakens the plant and slows recovery. The tree responds best when adjustments follow its natural rhythm rather than forcing rapid change. The evergreen nature of the cacao plant supports this long-term balance. Because leaves are always present, the plant is constantly exchanging gases with the surrounding air and drawing water from the soil. Sudden changes in temperature, moisture, or light can interrupt these processes and place stress on the tree. Stability allows the plant to focus energy on steady growth rather than repair. The cacao plant's physical form reflects its origin in layered forests. In natural settings, taller trees break direct sunlight into softer patterns that move across the understory. Cacao leaves are adapted to capture this shifting light efficiently. When exposed to full sun without protection, leaves can overheat, lose moisture too quickly, and suffer damage. For this reason, cacao plants perform best when their surroundings resemble forest conditions. Shade moderates temperature. Taller plants reduce wind. Moist air lingers near the leaves. These factors protect the cacao tree's delicate systems and support consistent development. Everything about the cacao plant points toward moderation rather than extremes. Its height, leaf structure, and growth rate all reflect a balance shaped by living among other plants rather than standing alone. Even when cultivated, the tree retains these preferences and responds poorly when they are ignored. The idea that chocolate begins in factories or kitchens overlooks the years spent establishing this plant. Each cacao tree represents seasons of growth before any harvest occurs. Evergreen leaves, controlled height, and careful shaping form the foundation for every pod that follows. The cacao plant completes most of its work quietly, long before its seeds are ever noticed. The cacao plant grows only within a narrow band of the world, shaped by heat, moisture, and sensitivity to even small changes in its surroundings. Its ability to survive depends on climate conditions that remain steady over long periods, without sharp shifts or extremes. This chapter focuses on the climate the cacao plant requires, how heat and moisture influence its growth, and why the plant reacts so strongly when those conditions drift outside its limits. Cacao plants grow best in hot, humid regions close to the equator. These areas receive relatively even sunlight throughout the year and experience little seasonal variation in day length. This consistency allows the cacao plant to maintain steady growth, rather than adjusting to changing light cycles. The plant's internal processes rely on this predictability, with leaves, stems, and roots all developing under similar conditions month after month. Temperatures in cacao growing regions remain warm year-round. The plant does not experience winter dormancy or seasonal shutdown. Instead, metabolic activity continues continuously, with water moving through the roots and sugars produced in the leaves without long interruptions. This constant warmth supports slow but uninterrupted development, allowing the tree to invest energy gradually into structure, foliage, and eventually pod production. Because the cacao plant depends on warmth, it is extremely sensitive to cold. Even brief exposure to low temperatures can damage leaves, interrupt water movement, and stress the plant's tissues. Frost is especially harmful, as ice crystals can rupture cells within leaves and young branches. Unlike plants adapted to temperate climates, cacao has no protective mechanisms to recover from freezing conditions. This sensitivity limits where cacao can be grown. Regions that experience occasional cold snaps, even if warm most of the year, pose risks to long-term plant health. Farmers must consider not only average temperatures, but also the likelihood of sudden drops that could weaken or kill trees. As a result, cacao cultivation remains concentrated in narrow climate zones. Rainfall plays an equally important role. Cacao plants require consistent moisture spread across the year rather than heavy rain, followed by long dry periods. Regular rainfall keeps the shallow root system supplied with water and supports nutrient uptake from the soil. When moisture arrives evenly, the plant can regulate growth without entering stress cycles. Extended drought reduces flowering and limits pod development. When water becomes scarce, the cacao plant prioritizes survival over reproduction. Leaves may slow photosynthesis, and energy is diverted away from flower production. Even after rainfall returns, recovery takes time, and pod yields may remain low for months. Excessive rainfall creates a different set of problems. Saturated soil restricts oxygen around the roots, interfering with respiration. High humidity combined with standing moisture encourages fungal growth on leaves, flowers, and developing pods. The cacao plant sensitivity means that balance is essential, with neither extreme dryness nor prolonged saturation being tolerated. Light exposure also shapes how cacao responds to climate. The plant prefers shade rather than direct, intense sunlight. In its natural environment, taller trees filter sunlight into softer patterns that move across the understory. This filtered light allows cacao leaves to photosynthesize efficiently, without overheating or losing water too quickly. When cacao plants are exposed to full sun, leaf temperature rises rapidly. Water evaporates faster than the roots can replace it, leading to stress even when soil moisture is present. Prolonged exposure to intense sunlight can scorch leaves and slow growth. Shade moderates these effects, keeping leaf temperature closer to the surrounding air. This preference for shade influences how cacao farms are designed. Trees are often grown beneath taller shade species that reduce heat and wind exposure. These companion trees create microclimates where temperature, humidity, and light remain within tolerable ranges. The cacao plant responds to these moderated conditions with steadier growth and improved resilience. Climate sensitivity means the cacao plant reacts strongly to small environmental changes. A slight shift in rainfall patterns or average temperature can alter flowering timing, reduce pollination success, or increase disease pressure. Because the plant operates continuously rather than seasonally, disruptions accumulate rather than resetting each year. Heat stress occurs when temperatures rise beyond the plant's optimal range. Leaves lose moisture more rapidly, and enzymes involved in photosynthesis function less efficiently. Over time, this reduces energy production and weakens the tree. Unlike short-lived crops, cacao trees must endure these stresses year after year. The combination of heat, moisture, and shade determines whether a cacao plant thrives or struggles. None of these factors operate independently. Warmth increases evaporation. Rainfall influences humidity. Shade alters temperature and moisture retention. The plant responds to the overall balance rather than any single condition. This dependence on balance explains why cacao cultivation cannot easily be moved or expanded without careful planning. Areas that appear suitable on paper may fail if one element falls outside the plant's tolerance. Successful growth depends on maintaining stable conditions that resemble the plant's original forest habitat. Over time, climate shifts place additional pressure on cacao plants. Gradual increases in temperature or changes in rainfall distribution push conditions closer to the plant's limits. Because cacao grows slowly, it cannot quickly adapt to new environments. Trees planted today may face different climates decades later. The cacao plant's sensitivity is not a flaw, but a reflection of its specialized evolution. It developed within a narrow ecological niche where conditions remained relatively stable. Within that niche, the plant performs well and produces valuable seeds. Outside it, survival becomes uncertain. Understanding these climate requirements helps explain why cacao farming involves careful site selection and long-term planning. The plant rewards consistency and patience, but responds poorly to extremes. Heat, moisture, and shade must align over years, not weeks, for the cacao tree to remain productive. This close relationship between climate and growth shapes every stage of the cacao plant's life. From leaf expansion to flower formation, environmental conditions guide outcomes quietly but decisively. The plant's sensitivity ensures that its success remains closely tied to the stability of the world around it. The cacao plant grows naturally beneath taller trees in tropical forests, where it develops as part of a layered environment rather than standing alone. In these forests, sunlight passes through several levels of leaves before reaching the cacao plant below. This filtered light arrives in soft, shifting patterns that provide enough energy for growth without exposing the plant to intense heat. The cacao plant's broad leaves are shaped to capture this gentle light while avoiding overheating. As young cacao plants establish themselves, surrounding trees play an important protective role. Taller vegetation reduces wind movement, limits sudden temperature changes, and helps keep moisture in the air close to the ground. These conditions create a stable space where cacao plants can grow slowly without constant stress. Instead of racing upward, the plant spreads its leaves and strengthens its stem within the shelter of the forest understory. This natural dependence on shade strongly shapes how cacao farms are designed. Traditional cacao farming often preserves taller trees above the cacao plants to recreate forest conditions. These shade trees regulate light levels throughout the day and prevent excessive heat from building around the cacao canopy. Their presence allows the cacao plant to maintain steady growth rather than reacting to extreme exposure. Shade also affects water use. When sunlight is softened, cacao leaves lose moisture more slowly through evaporation. This reduces strain on the plant's internal water transport system and helps maintain leaf function during warm periods. Soil beneath shaded trees also remains cooler and retains moisture for longer, supporting consistent root activity and reducing daily stress. When cacao plants are grown without shade, their growth patterns change noticeably. In open fields, leaves are exposed to direct sunlight for long hours, raising leaf temperature and increasing water loss. Even when irrigation is available, the surrounding air can become too dry for the plant's needs. Over time, this exposure weakens the cacao tree and reduces its ability to produce pods reliably. Monoculture environments further increase stress. When large numbers of cacao trees are planted together without other species, disease pressure rises sharply. Pathogens spread easily between identical hosts, and insects encounter little resistance as they move from tree to tree. Without biodiversity to interrupt these pathways, outbreaks can spread quickly and affect entire plantings. Soil conditions also suffer in simplified systems. Without a variety of plants contributing organic matter, topsoil becomes thinner and less active. Sun exposure dries the soil surface, reducing the presence of microorganisms that support nutrient cycling. As soil quality declines, cacao plants struggle to access the resources they need, even when fertilizers are added. The cacao plant has a shallow root system that depends heavily on surface soil. Rather than sending roots deep into the ground, the plant spreads fine roots close to the soil surface. These roots absorb water and nutrients from the upper soil layers, where organic material is most abundant. This design allows quick access to resources, but increases vulnerability to poor soil conditions. Because the roots remain near the surface, cacao plants respond quickly to changes in moisture. Compacted soil restricts root expansion and limits oxygen flow, interfering with respiration. Without sufficient oxygen, roots cannot function efficiently, leading to reduced growth and increased susceptibility to disease. Well-draining soil is essential for cacao survival. Although the plant requires regular rainfall, excess water must move through the soil rather than collect around the roots. Saturated conditions deprive roots of oxygen and encourage harmful microorganisms. Proper drainage allows moisture to remain available while preventing waterlogging. In forest systems, natural processes support good drainage. Fallen leaves, decaying wood, and varied root structures create spaces that allow air and water to circulate. Shade trees contribute organic matter that improves soil structure over time. These conditions help maintain a healthy balance between moisture retention and drainage. On cacao farms, maintaining this balance requires deliberate management. Farmers often use mulch or ground cover plants to protect the soil surface. Organic material slows evaporation, reduces erosion, and feeds soil organisms. When managed carefully, these practices support the cacao plant's shallow roots and reduce stress during heavy rains or dry periods. The relationship between shade, soil, and roots explains why cacao plants struggle in exposed environments. The plant is not adapted to isolation or constant sunlight. Its structure assumes cooperation with surrounding vegetation and living soil. Removing these supports forces the cacao plant to operate beyond its natural limits. Over time, cacao plants grown in diverse systems tend to show greater resilience. Their root systems remain healthier, and leaves recover more quickly from environmental stress. Disease pressure is often lower because varied plant life interrupts transmission pathways. These advantages accumulate slowly, but support long-term productivity. Understanding forest structure reveals why cacao cultivation rewards patience. Rather than maximizing short-term yield, successful systems focus on maintaining conditions that align with the plant's natural behavior. Shade, soil health, and root protection work together to sustain cacao trees over many years. This quiet reliance on surrounding systems defines how the cacao plant grows. It thrives within layered environments that provide shelter, nourishment, and balance. Beneath taller trees and within living soil, the cacao plant finds the conditions it needs to grow steadily and persist over time. These relationships remain essential throughout the life of the tree, supporting both survival and long-term productivity. The forest environment also slows sudden change. This benefits a plant that grows over decades. By buffering heat, moisture, and airflow together, layered systems reduce shock and allow gradual adjustment rather than abrupt strain. Growth continues gradually, without interruption. These conditions mirror the environment in which the species evolved and continue to depend upon. The cacao plant does not produce fruit quickly. After a young tree is planted, it can take 3 to 5 years before the first pods appear. During this time, the plant focuses on building its structure rather than reproduction. Roots spread through the upper soil, the trunk thickens gradually, and branches form a stable framework capable of supporting future growth. This long preparation period is essential because a weak or rushed structure cannot support consistent pod production later. As the cacao plant matures, energy use shifts slowly. Once the tree has enough leaves to support steady photosynthesis, it begins to invest resources into flowering. This transition does not happen suddenly. Flower buds appear in small numbers at first, and early yields are often limited. The plant continues to balance growth and reproduction, adding strength while learning how to sustain fruit development. When cacao plants reach maturity, they can continue producing pods for decades. A healthy tree can remain productive year after year if growing conditions remain stable. Leaves continue to renew themselves, branches thicken to support weight, and roots maintain access to water and nutrients. This long, productive life distinguishes cacao from many shorter-lived crops and explains why farming decisions have lasting consequences. Some cacao trees remain productive for over 50 years. These older trees often grow more slowly, but they can continue to flower and set pods when well cared for. Their trunks become thicker and more resilient, and their root systems stabilize surrounding soil. Longevity allows the plant to contribute consistently without the need for frequent replanting. The extended lifespan of cacao trees means that early care affects outcomes far into the future. Soil management, shade balance, and pruning practices influence how long a tree remains healthy. Stress experienced during early years can shorten productive life, while stable conditions support long-term resilience. One of the most distinctive features of the cacao plant is where its flowers grow. Instead of forming at the tips of branches, cacao flowers emerge directly from the trunk and main limbs. This unusual pattern places flowers close to the tree's strongest structures, where developing pods can be supported without bending or breaking thinner branches. This growth habit is known as cauliflory. Flowers form from specialized buds embedded in the bark, allowing repeated flowering in the same areas year after year. As the tree ages, these flowering points become more numerous, increasing the potential for pod formation along the trunk and thick branches. Cauliflory offers practical advantages. Pods that grow close to the trunk are easier for the tree to support and less likely to snap branches under their weight. This arrangement also places flowers and pods within reach of specific pollinators that move through shaded understory spaces rather than high canopy layers. As cacao trees age, cauliflory becomes more pronounced. Older trunks may display clusters of flowers and developing pods at different stages at the same time. This allows the tree to spread reproductive effort across seasons rather than concentrating all energy into a single period. The slow progression from planting to maturity reflects the cacao plant's overall pace. It is not designed for rapid cycles. Growth unfolds gradually, with each stage building upon the last. This steady rhythm allows the tree to remain productive for many years without exhausting its resources. Long-lived cacao trees also reflect accumulated adaptation to their environment. Roots expand into favorable soil pockets, branches adjust to shade patterns, and flowering aligns with local conditions. Over time, the tree becomes more efficient at using available resources. Because cacao trees take years to mature, farmers must plan far ahead. Decisions made early cannot be reversed quickly. Removing a mature tree means losing years of future production, while protecting it preserves long-term value. This encourages careful stewardship rather than frequent replacement. The contrast between slow maturity and long productivity defines cacao farming. Patience is required before rewards appear, but once established, the tree offers steady output. This balance explains why cacao cultivation is closely tied to long-term land management. The physical structure of mature cacao trees reflects their history. Thickened trunks, reinforced branch joints, and repeated flowering points tell the story of years of growth. Each pod represents not just a season's effort, but the result of long preparation. Time shapes every aspect of the cacao plant's life. From the first years spent establishing roots to decades of fruiting, the tree follows a measured pace. This rhythm supports endurance rather than speed. Understanding the cacao plant's long life helps explain why it responds poorly to shortcuts. Rapid forcing of growth can weaken structure and shorten productive years. In contrast, steady care allows the tree to reach its full lifespan and potential. The cacao plant's maturity is not marked by a single moment, but by a gradual transition into sustained productivity. Once established, it continues quietly, producing pods season after season. This long arc of growth defines the plant and underpins everything that follows. Cacao flowers are tiny and delicate, and their scale is easy to miss because they appear against the thick bark of the trunk and older branches. Each flower is only a few millimeters across, with fine parts arranged in a tight structure. The petals form a small cup with narrow passages, and the reproductive surfaces sit inside spaces that are protected rather than exposed. Even when a tree carries many blooms at once, the flowers do not dominate the tree visually. They sit close to the bark, often facing outward from the trunk, where they can be reached by very small insects moving through shaded air. Because the flowers are so small, the tree produces them in very large numbers. Thousands of cacao flowers can open over a period of time, appearing along the trunk and the main branches in scattered clusters. This is not one single burst followed by silence. Flowers can appear repeatedly, so that some are opening while others are fading. The tree repeats this effort because each bloom offers only a short window for pollination. A flower can open, remain receptive for a limited time, and then drop away. The tree keeps offering new flowers because the odds for any one bloom are naturally low. Only a small fraction of cacao flowers become pods. Most of them never develop into fruit, and that outcome is normal for cacao rather than unusual. A flower must receive pollen in a precise way for the ovary to begin forming a pod. If pollen does not arrive, or arrives too late, the flower cannot start that process. The bloom withers, the tree sheds it, and resources are redirected elsewhere. This pattern protects the tree because it cannot support unlimited pods at the same time, even if every flower could be fertilized. This is why the tree lets most flowers end without fruit. Most cacao flowers never produce fruit, and the gap between flowering and harvest can surprise people who expect a direct link between the two. A trunk might be dotted with fresh blossoms, yet later in the year, only a modest number of pods will be present. This does not mean the tree lacks energy or that it is failing to bloom properly. It means the tree is using a strategy that depends on rare success rather than frequent certainty. The plant can afford to make many flowers, but it cannot afford to grow a pod from every bloom. The reason cacao flowers need so many attempts is that they rely on a very specific pollinator. Cacao flowers depend on tiny insects called midges for pollination. Midges are small enough to move within the flower's narrow structure and reach the pollen-bearing and pollen-receiving surfaces. Their bodies and legs fit into spaces that larger insects cannot access. When a midge enters a cacao flower, it can brush against pollen, carry grains on its body, and then transfer some of that pollen as it moves into the next flower along the trunk. Bees are too large to pollinate cacao flowers effectively. This is not because bees are absent from cacao growing regions, but because the geometry of the cacao flower does not suit them. A typical bee cannot navigate the narrow passages within the flower in the way the plant requires. The bee's body is too large to make the right contact with the tiny internal surfaces. Even if a bee lands on a cacao flower, its movement tends to remain on the outside, while the critical points of contact sit deeper within the flower than a large insect can easily reach. The flower's delicacy strengthens this limitation. The tissues are thin and do not tolerate heavy disturbance. A larger insect would be more likely to damage the flower or fail to reach the right surfaces during the short receptive period. Midges, by contrast, can enter and move with little force. Their small weight and fine movements allow them to explore the interior without tearing it apart. In practice, the cacao flower is built for a visitor that fits, not for a visitor that can push its way through. Because most flowers fail, the tree's flowering behavior is built around probability. Instead of investing heavily in a small number of flowers, it produces many and accepts that most will end quickly. This reduces the cost of failure. If a flower is not pollinated, the tree can shed it without having committed months of resources. If a flower is pollinated, the tree can then begin the slower and more expensive process of pod formation. The large number of flowers is therefore a way of selecting the few successful ones after many endings that cost very little. Midge pollination also introduces another limit. This is that midges live within very local conditions. They tend to thrive in damp, shaded environments where decaying organic matter is present. Moist leaf litter, rotting fruit, and decomposing wood can provide places for midges to breed and develop. In an intact understory, these damp pockets are common, and the air remains humid enough for midges to stay active. If the ground is cleared too thoroughly or allowed to dry out, midge numbers can drop even when the trees appear healthy above ground. When midge numbers are lower, the tree may still produce thousands of flowers, but fewer blooms will receive the visits needed for fertilization. The limitation is not the tree's capacity to bloom. It is the small traffic of pollinators moving through the shaded space around the trunk and branches. Timing matters as well. Because a flower is receptive for only a short period, a visit that arrives too early or too late cannot create a pod. A tree can carry many open flowers at once and still have very few that remain and begin the slow path toward becoming pods. A successful pollination event can be subtle. The bloom may wither as expected, but a small swelling can remain at its base. Over time, that swelling becomes the beginning of a pod. The tree then directs resources into that growing structure, thickening it gradually and anchoring it close to the trunk where the wood is strongest. When a pod later becomes obvious on the bark, it represents not only months of growth, but also a rare success among many blossoms that ended quickly and fell away. In cacao, pollination is a quiet, limited process shaped by size and fit. The flower is built for a small insect and offers only a narrow window for contact. The tree compensates by flowering in large numbers and accepting that most attempts will end without fruit. From thousands of delicate blossoms, only a few continue forward, and those few become the pods that carry cacao seeds. Without tiny pollinating insects, chocolate would not exist. The cacao plant depends entirely on successful pollination for pods to form, and without that initial transfer of pollen, no amount of care or favorable weather can produce cacao beans. Every pod begins with a single successful contact between flower and insect, making pollination the most critical and limiting step in the cacao plant's reproductive cycle. Pollination rates in cacao plants are naturally low. Even under ideal conditions, only a small percentage of flowers receive pollen in the precise way required for fertilization. This is not a flaw in the plant's design. It is a built-in limitation that reflects the cacao plant's dependence on specialized pollinators and narrow timing. The plant compensates for this by producing large numbers of flowers rather than by increasing the success rate of each individual bloom. Because pollination is rare, it directly limits how many pods a single cacao tree can produce. A healthy tree may flower continuously, yet only a small number of those flowers will develop into pods over the course of a year. The tree does not attempt to grow pods from every fertilized flower either. Instead, it regulates how many developing pods it can support at one time, balancing reproductive effort with long-term survival. Once pollination occurs, pod development begins slowly. The fertilized flower withers, but a small swelling remains at its base. Over time, this swelling thickens and elongates, gradually becoming recognizable as a cacao pod. This process does not happen quickly. Growth continues over many weeks, with the pod increasing in size as cells divide and expand. It typically takes 5 to 6 months for a cacao pod to fully mature after pollination. During this period, the tree supplies water, sugars, and nutrients to the developing pod through vascular tissue embedded in the bark. The pod remains firmly attached to the trunk or branch where the wood is strongest. This slow development reflects the plant's overall pace and the cost of producing seeds rich in fats and nutrients. Pollination rarity shapes the appearance of cacao trees. A tree may carry pods at different stages of development at the same time. Some pods are newly formed, others are half-grown, and a few may be approaching maturity. This staggered pattern spreads demand on the tree's resources rather than concentrating it into a single season. The tree maintains a steady output rather than exhausting itself all at once. The low success rate also means that each pod represents a rare outcome. Among thousands of flowers that opened and closed, only a handful progressed beyond the earliest stage. Each successful pod reflects a specific moment when a pollinator arrived at the right flower at the right time and transferred pollen effectively. Because pollination depends on tiny insects, environmental conditions around the tree play a major role. Moist air, shaded ground, and the presence of decaying organic matter support midge populations. When these conditions decline, pollination rates often fall even if the trees appear otherwise healthy. The tree can continue flowering, But without pollinators moving through the understory, pod formation remains limited. The cacao plant does not adjust by making larger flowers or attracting different insects. Its reproductive strategy is fixed. It continues producing small flowers and relies on the same narrow window for success. This makes the plant sensitive to disruptions that affect pollinator behavior or abundance. Once a pod has begun to form, the tree commits to supporting it through months of growth. Resources are directed toward the developing seeds inside the pod, while many flowers continue to fall unused. The tree constantly balances growth, maintenance, and reproduction, prioritizing stability over maximum output. The slow pace of pod growth also exposes developing pods to risk. Storms, pests, or disease can damage pods before they mature. Because the tree produces relatively few pods, the loss of even one can matter. This reinforces the importance of stable conditions throughout the long development period. Pollination rarity therefore influences not only how many pods appear, but also how cacao farming is managed. Practices that support pollinators and reduce stress during pod development can have a greater impact than efforts to increase flowering alone. The tree already produces more flowers than it can convert into fruit. The 5 to 6 months required for pod maturation reflect the complexity of what the pod contains. Inside, seeds accumulate fats, proteins, and carbohydrates that will later become cacao beans. This accumulation takes time and cannot be rushed without compromising seed quality. The cacao plant's reproductive cycle is shaped by limitation rather than abundance. Pollination is rare, pod development is slow, output is carefully regulated. These constraints protect the plant from overextending itself and allow it to remain productive over many years. Each mature pod on a cacao tree represents a long chain of conditions aligning successfully. A suitable pollinator, stable environment, sustained support from the tree, and months without severe disruption are all required. When these conditions are met, the pod reaches maturity and becomes ready for harvest. Pollination rarity ensures that cacao remains tied to healthy ecosystems. The tree cannot produce pods independently of its surroundings. Its success depends on insects, climate, and time working together. This interconnectedness defines the cacao plant's life cycle and shapes every stage that follows. Cacao pods grow directly from the trunk and from the thick main branches of the cacao tree rather than from thin outer twigs. This placement keeps the developing pods close to the strongest parts of the tree, where weight can be supported without bending or breaking. The attachment point is firm, and as the pod grows heavier over time, the trunk and large limbs absorb the strain. This growth pattern allows the tree to carry multiple pods at once without structural damage. Because pods emerge from the trunk and major branches, a single cacao tree can hold pods at many different stages of development at the same time. Some pods may be newly formed and still small, while others nearby may be fully grown and ready for harvest. This overlapping pattern reflects the tree's continuous flowering and low pollination success. Rather than producing all fruit at once, the tree spreads development across months, balancing energy use and reducing sudden demand on its internal systems. The presence of pods at different stages also means the tree is constantly adjusting resource flow. Water, sugars, and nutrients move through the trunk to support pods that are growing at different rates. Younger pods require cell division and expansion, while older pods focus on filling seeds with stored compounds. The tree manages this distribution gradually, maintaining stability rather than surging toward a single peak. Cacao pods vary widely in color, depending on both variety and ripeness. Some pods begin green and turn yellow as they mature. Others may shift from red or purple to orange or remain dark even when fully ripe. Color alone does not always indicate maturity, but it provides visual cues that farmers learn to interpret over time. These color changes result from pigment breakdown and transformation within the pod's outer layer as it develops. The variation in color also reflects genetic diversity among cacao plants. Different varieties produce pods with distinct shapes, surface textures, and color patterns. Some pods are smooth, while others are deeply ridged. These physical traits influence how the pod grows and how it responds to environmental stress, but they do not change the basic structure shared by all cacao pods. As pods mature, their outer walls become thick and tough. The pod's skin is designed to protect the seeds inside from physical damage, insects, and moisture loss. This thickness develops gradually as the pod grows, with layers of fibrous tissue forming a protective shell. By the time the pod is ready for harvest, the outer wall is firm enough to resist casual pressure. The toughness of the pod also helps regulate internal conditions. Inside the shell, the seeds are surrounded by moist pulp that must remain protected for proper development. The thick pod wall limits rapid drying and shields the interior from sudden temperature changes. This stable internal environment supports the slow accumulation of nutrients within the seeds. Because cacao pods are tough, they require sharp tools to open. Harvesting involves cutting the pod carefully without damaging the seeds inside or injuring the tree. The pod does not split easily on its own. This prevents premature exposure of the seeds to air or pests while still on the tree. The weight of mature pods places additional demands on the tree. Each pod can become heavy as it fills with seeds and pulp. The tree compensates by thickening attachment points and strengthening nearby wood. Pods positioned close to the trunk reduce leverage forces that could otherwise strain branches. Pods growing at different heights along the trunk experience slightly different micro-conditions. Those closer to the ground may be more shaded and humid, while those higher up receive more airflow. Despite these differences, the tree maintains pod development across positions, adjusting water and nutrient flow accordingly. The presence of multiple pods on a single tree reflects successful pollination events spread over time. Each pod represents a separate moment when a flower was fertilized and sustained. The tree does not synchronize these events. This reduces risk. If one pod fails due to damage or disease, others may continue developing. Cacao pods remain attached to the tree throughout their long growth period. They do not drop early or detach easily. This prolonged attachment ensures continuous access to the tree's resources until the seeds are fully formed. Only when harvested by hand are pods removed from the trunk. The visible presence of pods on the tree marks the most recognizable stage of cacao growth. Long before processing begins, the tree carries these large, colorful structures quietly against its bark. Each pod reflects months of development and careful balance within the tree. Pods on the trunk also make harvesting more efficient. Workers can see and reach them without climbing into the canopy. This reduces damage to branches and limits disturbance to surrounding growth. The tree remains intact and productive after each harvest. The way cacao pods grow and attach to the tree shows how the plant prioritizes protection and stability. Thick walls, strong attachment points, and staggered development all reduce risk. These features ensure that the limited number of pods produced have the best chance of reaching maturity. Pods on the tree represent the culmination of earlier stages, from flowering to pollination to slow growth. They are not abundant, but they are carefully supported. Each one carries seeds that will later become cacao beans, completing another cycle in the long life of the cacao plant. Inside each cacao pod, the interior is organized in a very specific way. When a pod is opened, the first thing revealed is a series of rows running lengthwise from one end to the other. These rows are made up of cacao seeds, arranged in a neat, repeating pattern. The seeds are positioned tightly together, held in place by the structure of the pod itself. This orderly layout ensures that each seed remains protected and supplied with moisture during development. The seeds are not loose inside the pod. They are embedded within a thick, soft pulp that surrounds them completely. This pulp fills the spaces between the seeds and presses them gently against one another. Its texture is smooth and slippery, forming a cushioning layer that prevents seeds from drying out or shifting as the pod grows. The pulp also helps regulate the internal environment by holding moisture and maintaining stable conditions. The pulp inside a cacao pod is pale in color, often white or slightly translucent. It clings closely to each seed, coating it fully. This coating plays an important role during the later stages of processing, but while the pod is still intact, it primarily serves to protect and nourish the seeds. The pulp is rich in sugars and water, creating an environment that supports seed development until harvest. The taste of fresh cacao pulp is surprisingly fruity. When sampled directly from a freshly opened pod, the pulp has a sweet, slightly acidic flavor, often compared to citrus or tropical fruit. This sweetness comes from natural sugars that accumulate during pod development. Although the pulp is rarely eaten in large quantities, its flavor is an important part of what happens next once the seeds are removed from the pod. The seeds themselves are what eventually become cacao beans. At this stage, they are not yet beans in the sense most people recognize. They are living seeds, capable of sprouting if conditions allow. Each seed has a protective outer coat and internal tissues designed to support early growth. The flavor commonly associated with chocolate is not present yet. Instead, the seeds are bitter and astringent, reflecting their natural chemical composition. A single cacao pod typically contains between 20 and 50 seeds. The exact number varies depending on the variety of cacao and growing conditions. Some pods are densely packed, with seeds pressed tightly together, while others contain fewer seeds, with more pulp filling the space. This variation affects how much usable material each pod yields after processing. The arrangement of seeds within the pod allows them to share resources evenly. Nutrients supplied by the tree enter the pod and are distributed through the pulp to each developing seed. This shared environment ensures that no single seed dominates at the expense of others. All seeds mature together, reaching readiness at roughly the same time. Once a pod is harvested, the seeds must be removed promptly. If left inside the pod for too long after cutting, conditions change quickly. Heat builds, moisture levels shift, and the internal environment begins to break down. Removing the seeds soon after harvest preserves their quality and prepares them for the next stage. Freshly removed cacao seeds, still coated in pulp, are often referred to as wet beans. At this point, they do not resemble the dry brown beans associated with chocolate production. Their surfaces are pale and slick, and their internal structure remains intact. They are still biologically active and capable of germination. The pulp surrounding the seeds plays a critical role once the seeds are removed from the pod. Its sugar content becomes fuel for microorganisms during fermentation. Without this pulp, the next transformation could not occur. The pulp provides both moisture and energy, creating conditions that allow fermentation to begin naturally. The number of seeds per pod influences how fermentation unfolds. Pods with more seeds produce larger masses of pulp and seeds. This retains heat more effectively. This heat supports microbial activity and helps drive chemical changes inside the seeds. Pods with fewer seeds may ferment differently, depending on how they are grouped with others. Although the seeds are destined to become cacao beans, they are not yet stable. Their moisture content is high, and their chemical makeup is still evolving. At this stage, the seeds are fragile and must be handled carefully to avoid damage. Crushing or drying them too early would interrupt necessary processes and ruin potential flavor. The interior of a cacao pod reflects careful biological design. The thick outer shell protects the contents from the external environment, while the pulp and seed arrangement create a controlled internal space. This design supports slow, even development over several months. Each seed inside the pod represents a potential cacao bean, but only if the correct steps follow. The pulp must be allowed to do its work. The seeds must undergo transformation. What begins as a living seed coated in sweet pulp must change completely before it can contribute to chocolate. The transition from seed to bean begins the moment the pod is opened. Exposure to air, heat from surrounding seeds, and microbial activity all start to alter the internal chemistry. This shift is intentional and necessary. The raw materials inside the pod are prepared by the plant, but the next stages depend on careful handling. Seeds inside the pod are uniform in purpose but varied in outcome. Subtle differences in size, position, and pulp coverage can influence how each seed responds during fermentation. These small variations contribute to complexity later, even though all seeds begin in the same enclosed space. The cacao pod is therefore not just a container, it is a developmental chamber where seeds are protected, fed, and arranged for the final phase of their growth on the tree. Once opened, its role ends, and the seeds begin a new stage shaped by human action rather than plant structure. Everything that happens later depends on what is present at this moment. Rows of seeds, thick pulp, living tissue, and natural sugars form the foundation. Without this precise arrangement, the transformation into cacao beans could not occur. Harvesting cacao pods is done carefully and almost entirely by hand. When a pod reaches maturity, it is cut from the trunk or main branch using a sharp knife or machete. The cut is made close to the stem of the pod, avoiding damage to the tree's bark. This precision matters because injuries to the trunk can interfere with future flowering and pod development. Harvesting is therefore a deliberate process rather than a quick removal. Once pods are cut from the tree, they are usually opened soon afterward. Cacao pods do not store well when left intact for long periods after harvest. Heat builds inside the pod, and the internal environment begins to change in uncontrolled ways. Opening the pod allows the next stage to begin under more predictable conditions. Timing at this stage affects everything that follows. When the pod is split open, the seeds are removed along with the surrounding pulp. These seeds are often called cacao beans but at this point they do not yet have the flavor people associate with chocolate. Fresh cacao seeds taste bitter and sharp, and the pulp around them is sweet and fruity. The familiar chocolate flavor has not formed yet. It must be created through a controlled biological process. Flavor development begins through fermentation. Fermentation starts almost immediately once the pod is opened and the seeds are exposed to air. Microorganisms present on the pod surface, in the air, and on surrounding tools begin to interact with the sugars in the pulp. This process does not require added cultures. It begins naturally because the conditions are already suitable. During fermentation, cacao seeds are typically piled together or placed into boxes. Grouping the seeds allows heat to build within the mass. This warmth supports microbial activity and drives chemical changes inside the seeds. The pulp surrounding the seeds begins to break down as sugars are consumed and liquid drains away. As fermentation progresses, temperature rises inside the pile or box. This heat penetrates the seeds and alters their internal structure. The living embryo inside each seed is destroyed. This prevents sprouting. This step is essential. If the seed remained alive, later flavor development would be inconsistent and unstable. Fermentation also reduces bitterness and begins forming complex flavor compounds. Chemical reactions inside the seed transform harsh-tasting components into precursors of chocolate flavor. These reactions occur gradually over several days. Rushing fermentation interrupts this process and results in flat or unpleasant flavors. The length of fermentation varies, but often lasts several days. Seeds may be turned or moved during this time to introduce oxygen and ensure even fermentation. Without movement, some areas may ferment too quickly, while others remain underdeveloped. Careful handling keeps conditions balanced throughout the batch. During fermentation, the pulp surrounding the seeds changes dramatically. It becomes thinner and less sweet as sugars are consumed. The pulp drains away, leaving the seeds exposed. This change helps regulate temperature and moisture levels within the fermenting mass. The process is sensitive to environment. Excess rain, cool temperatures, or poor drainage can interfere with fermentation. If the pile becomes too wet, fermentation slows and unwanted microorganisms may grow. If it becomes too dry, heat cannot build properly. Farmers must adjust methods based on local conditions. Fresh cacao seeds that have not been fermented lack the foundation needed for chocolate production. Their chemical profile is incomplete. Fermentation initiates reactions that continue later during drying and roasting. Without this first transformation, later steps cannot compensate. Fermentation also influences texture and aroma. The breakdown of internal structures within the seed allows fats and solids to interact differently during later processing. These early changes affect how chocolate melts and how aromas are released when it is consumed. Because fermentation begins immediately after pods are opened, delays can cause problems. Leaving seeds exposed without proper piling or boxing can lead to uneven microbial activity. Controlled fermentation ensures consistency across batches and preserves potential quality. The act of piling or boxing seeds is therefore more than storage. It is a controlled biological environment. Heat, moisture, oxygen, and time work together to reshape the seeds. Each factor must remain within a narrow range for successful transformation. Although fermentation relies on natural microorganisms, it is not random. Experienced farmers recognize signs of healthy fermentation, such as rising temperature and characteristic aromas. These cues guide decisions about turning, draining, and timing. At the end of fermentation, the seeds have changed completely. They are no longer living. Their bitterness has softened, and the chemical groundwork for chocolate flavor has been laid. However, the process is not finished. The seeds are still wet and unstable, requiring further handling. Harvest and fermentation together mark the transition from plant growth to human processing. The cacao plant provides seeds and pulp, but flavor only begins to emerge once people intervene. This stage bridges biology and craftsmanship. Every step during harvest and fermentation influences final quality. Careless cutting, delayed opening, or poorly managed fermentation can undo years of plant growth. Conversely, careful handling preserves what the tree has produced. Fermentation does not create chocolate on its own, but it makes chocolate possible. The flavors that will later deepen and refine begin here, shaped by heat, microbes, and time. This stage depends on patience and attention rather than speed. Seeds must remain together long enough for transformation, but not so long that decay takes over. Balance determines success. Harvest and fermentation therefore form the first human-guided chapter in the cacao plant's journey. From this point onward, the seeds are no longer part of the tree's life. They move into a new process, carrying with them the results of careful timing and controlled change. After fermentation is complete, cacao seeds are still wet and unstable. They contain high levels of moisture, and their internal chemistry is still active. At this stage, the seeds cannot be stored or transported safely. Drying is required to slow biological activity and stabilize the seeds so they can be preserved without spoilage. This step begins immediately after fermentation ends. Drying usually takes place in the sun. The fermented seeds are spread out in thin layers on mats, trays, or raised platforms that allow air to circulate. Sunlight provides gentle heat, while open air allows moisture to evaporate gradually. The goal is not to bake the seeds, but to remove water at a controlled pace. Drying too quickly can trap unwanted flavors inside the seed, while drying too slowly increases the risk of mold. As drying progresses, moisture levels inside the seeds steadily decrease. Water moves from the interior toward the surface and evaporates into the surrounding air. This process takes several days and requires regular attention. Seeds are often turned or mixed to ensure even exposure to air and sunlight. Without movement, seeds on the bottom may remain damp, while those on top dry too quickly. Reducing moisture is essential for long-term stability. High moisture levels allow microorganisms to continue growing. This can lead to spoilage or off flavors. Proper drying lowers moisture enough to halt microbial activity without damaging the seed's internal structure. Once dried correctly, the seeds become firm and less prone to crushing. Drying also helps lock in the chemical changes initiated during fermentation. Flavor precursors formed during fermentation remain stable once moisture is reduced. If drying is interrupted or incomplete, these compounds can degrade or shift in unwanted ways. The drying stage therefore protects the work already done, rather than creating new flavors. Improper drying can ruin quality. If seeds dry unevenly, some may remain acidic or bitter, while others over-dry and lose complexity. Excessive heat can cause surface cracking. This exposes the interior to air and increases oxidation. In contrast, insufficient drying leaves seeds vulnerable to mold growth during storage or transport. Environmental conditions strongly influence drying. High humidity slows evaporation and extends drying time. Unexpected rain can reintroduce moisture, forcing farmers to gather seeds quickly and protect them. Drying systems must adapt to local climate, balancing exposure with protection to maintain consistency. As seeds dry, their appearance changes. They darken in color and lose their slick surface. The pulp residue left from fermentation dries and flakes away. Inside, the seed structure becomes more rigid as water content decreases. These physical changes signal progress, but must be confirmed by careful handling rather than appearance alone. Quality control during drying involves constant observation. Farmers monitor texture, smell, and feel. Seeds that smell musty or feel soft indicate problems. Experienced handlers recognize when drying is proceeding correctly and when adjustments are needed. This judgment comes from repeated exposure rather than fixed timing. Once drying is complete, seeds are considered stable. They can be stored, transported, or sold without immediate risk of spoilage. However, stability depends on maintaining dry conditions. Exposure to moisture after drying can reverse progress and introduce mold. Drying also influences later processing steps. Seeds that are evenly dried respond more predictably during roasting. Moisture differences can cause uneven heating, leading to inconsistent flavor development. Quality drying therefore supports uniformity further along the production chain. Because drying occurs outdoors in many regions, it requires coordination with weather patterns. Farmers may dry seeds over several days, covering them at night or during rain. This repeated handling ensures that drying continues gradually rather than stopping abruptly. The process rewards patience. Rushing drying by increasing heat may shorten time, but often reduces quality. Slow, steady moisture reduction preserves the balance achieved during fermentation. This mirrors the cacao plant's overall rhythm, where gradual change produces better results than forced speed. Drying marks the transition from biological transformation to physical preservation. Fermentation reshaped the seed internally. Drying stabilizes that new state and prepares the seed for long journeys and further processing. Quality control does not end when drying finishes. Dried seeds are often inspected again before storage or shipment. Broken, moldy, or poorly dried seeds may be removed. This sorting improves overall consistency and reduces the chance that defects affect larger batches. The success of drying depends on earlier steps. Well-fermented seeds dry more evenly than poorly fermented ones. Clean handling during harvest and fermentation reduces contamination during drying. Each stage builds upon the last. Drying therefore acts as a checkpoint. It reveals whether earlier processes were managed carefully. Seeds that dry cleanly and evenly indicate successful fermentation. Seeds that resist drying or develop odors suggest problems upstream. Once dried, cacao seeds are no longer fragile living tissue. They become durable agricultural products, capable of enduring storage and transport. This durability allows cacao to move from growing regions to distant processing centers without losing its potential. Drying completes the transformation that began when the pod was opened. The seeds are no longer part of the plant's life cycle. They have been stabilized and prepared for the next stage, carrying within them the preserved results of careful timing, controlled change, and patient handling. The cacao plant is highly sensitive to environmental stress, and even small changes in growing conditions can affect its health. Because the plant operates continuously rather than seasonally, stress does not reset each year. Instead, it accumulates over time. Heat, moisture imbalance, and poor soil conditions place strain on the plant's internal systems, reducing its ability to flower, set pods, and resist disease. Drought is one of the most disruptive stresses cacao plants face. When rainfall drops below consistent levels, the shallow root system struggles to access enough water. Leaves lose moisture faster than it can be replaced, and photosynthesis slows. The plant responds by conserving energy. This often means reducing flower production and limiting pod development. Even after rainfall returns, recovery can take months. Extended dry periods also affect internal transport. Water movement through the trunk becomes less efficient, reducing the flow of nutrients and sugars. This weakens developing pods and can cause flowers to drop before pollination occurs. Drought stress therefore reduces both current yield and future potential by weakening the tree's overall condition. Too much rain creates a different form of stress. Excess moisture saturates the soil and restricts oxygen around the roots. Without adequate oxygen, root respiration slows and nutrient uptake becomes inefficient. Prolonged saturation weakens root tissue and creates favorable conditions for harmful microorganisms. Even healthy-looking trees can suffer internal damage under these conditions. High humidity combined with frequent rain increases the risk of fungal disease. Moist surfaces allow spores to germinate and spread easily across leaves, flowers, and pods. Fungal infections can interfere with photosynthesis, damage developing pods, and cause premature fruit loss. Once established, these diseases are difficult to control without changing environmental conditions. Cacao plants are vulnerable to several plant diseases that can spread rapidly under stress. When trees are weakened by drought or excess moisture, their natural defenses decline. Pathogens that would normally be resisted can gain a foothold. Disease outbreaks often follow periods of environmental imbalance rather than appearing randomly. Some diseases attack leaves, reducing the plant's ability to produce energy. Others target pods, causing rot before seeds mature. In severe cases, entire harvests can be lost. Because cacao trees take years to reach maturity, losses from disease represent not just a single season's failure, but the erosion of long-term investment. Disease pressure is often higher in environments where biodiversity is reduced. When cacao is grown in uniform plantings, pathogens spread more easily from tree to tree. Lack of variation allows diseases to move quickly without encountering natural barriers. This makes stressed plantations particularly vulnerable to large-scale loss. Environmental stress and disease interact closely. Stress weakens the plant, making infection more likely. Infection then increases stress by diverting resources toward defense rather than growth. This cycle can continue unless conditions improve or intervention occurs. Because cacao plants grow slowly, they cannot quickly replace damaged tissue. A diseased branch or damaged root may affect productivity for years. This slow recovery amplifies the impact of stress events and disease outbreaks. Managing environmental stress therefore becomes a primary strategy for disease prevention. Maintaining proper shade, drainage, and moisture balance reduces pressure on the plant and supports its natural defenses. Healthy trees are better able to limit infection and recover from damage. The unpredictability of stress events makes cacao farming challenging. Rainfall patterns may shift unexpectedly. Heat waves may last longer than usual. These changes push the plant closer to its tolerance limits. Because cacao is sensitive, small shifts can have large effects. Farmers often observe stress through changes in flowering patterns or leaf condition before disease becomes visible. Reduced flowering, yellowing leaves, or slowed growth can signal underlying problems. Early recognition allows adjustments that may prevent further decline. Disease outbreaks can wipe out entire harvests when conditions favor rapid spread. This risk shapes how cacao is grown and managed. Strategies that support plant health over maximum short-term yield often reduce vulnerability to catastrophic loss. Environmental stress highlights the cacao plant's reliance on balance rather than resilience to extremes. The plant evolved in stable forest conditions where moisture and temperature varied little. When those conditions change, stress appears quickly. Understanding stress and disease explains why cacao production can fluctuate dramatically from year to year. Even experienced farmers cannot fully control weather or regional climate shifts. The plant responds directly to these forces. The cacao plant's sensitivity does not make it fragile by design, but specialized. Within its preferred range, it performs reliably. Outside it, stress accumulates and disease follows. Environmental stress and disease therefore shape the limits of cacao production. They define how much the plant can produce and how consistently. Managing these pressures is essential for long-term productivity. Each healthy harvest reflects years in which stress remained manageable and disease was kept in check. When balance holds, the cacao plant continues its slow, steady work. When it breaks, losses can be sudden and severe. Cacao farming is often unpredictable because the plant responds quickly to changes in its surroundings. Even when trees appear healthy, small shifts in moisture, temperature, or airflow can alter flowering and pod development. This unpredictability is not random. It reflects how closely the cacao plant is tied to the conditions around it. When those conditions fluctuate, production follows. Healthy cacao plants depend on biodiversity rather than isolation. In natural settings, cacao grows among many other species, including taller trees, ground cover plants, insects, fungi, and microorganisms. These living systems interact continuously. Leaves fall and decompose, insects move between plants, and soil organisms recycle nutrients. This diversity creates balance, reducing pressure from pests and disease while supporting steady growth. Mixed forests reduce disease pressure naturally. When different plant species grow together, pathogens encounter barriers that slow their spread. A disease adapted to cacao cannot move as easily when non-host plants interrupt contact between trees. Insects that carry pathogens are less likely to travel directly from one cacao plant to another when vegetation is varied. This interruption lowers the chance of widespread outbreaks. Traditional cacao farming often mimics forest conditions rather than removing them. Instead of clearing land completely, farmers maintain a layered canopy above cacao trees. Taller shade trees remain in place, allowing cacao to grow beneath them as it would in the wild. This approach preserves many of the ecological relationships the plant relies on, including stable microclimates and active soil systems. Shade trees protect cacao from heat and wind. Their canopies reduce direct sunlight, keeping leaf temperatures lower and slowing moisture loss. Wind movement is softened. This prevents leaves from drying too quickly and reduces physical stress on branches. These protections are especially important during periods of high temperature or irregular rainfall. Shade also helps regulate humidity around the cacao plant. Moist air lingers beneath tree canopies, supporting leaf function and reducing water stress. This stable humidity benefits not only the cacao tree, but also the insects and microorganisms that support pollination and soil health. When shade is removed, humidity drops and conditions become harsher. Biodiversity contributes to soil quality as well. Different plants shed leaves and roots at varying rates, adding organic matter to the soil. This organic material feeds microorganisms that improve nutrient availability. Healthy soil supports the cacao plant's shallow roots and improves resilience during both dry and wet periods. In shaded systems, soil temperature remains more stable. Cooler soil slows evaporation and protects fine roots near the surface. During heavy rain, organic matter improves drainage, reducing the risk of waterlogging. These factors work together to create conditions the cacao plant evolved to tolerate. Shade-grown cacao often shows fewer signs of stress over time. Leaves maintain color and function longer. Flowering patterns remain more consistent. Pod loss due to environmental extremes is reduced. While yields may not spike dramatically in any single season, production tends to remain steadier across years. The presence of diverse plant life also supports natural pest control. Predatory insects and birds that feed on pests are more common in mixed environments. This reduces reliance on chemical interventions and lowers stress on the cacao plant. When pest populations remain balanced, the tree can devote more energy to growth and reproduction. Biodiversity does not eliminate risk, but it reduces extremes. Disease can still occur, and weather events can still cause damage. However, diverse systems recover more quickly. When one element is disrupted, others continue functioning, allowing the system to stabilize rather than collapse. Shade farming requires long-term planning. Shade trees grow slowly and must be managed carefully to balance light and protection. Too much shade can limit photosynthesis, while too little exposes cacao to stress. Farmers adjust pruning and spacing over time, responding to how trees grow and interact. This approach values sustainability over rapid expansion. Rather than maximizing short-term yield, shade-based systems aim for durability. Trees remain productive longer, soil health improves, and disease pressure stays manageable. These benefits accumulate gradually, rather than appearing immediately. Cacao plants grown in biodiverse systems often show greater tolerance to climate variation. Shade buffers temperature spikes, and organic soil retains moisture during dry periods. As climate patterns become less predictable, these buffering effects become increasingly important. Biodiversity also connects cacao farming to surrounding landscapes. Forest fragments, waterways, and wildlife corridors support the movement of insects and animals that contribute to ecosystem health. Cacao farms that integrate with these features maintain stronger ecological links than isolated plantations. Shade-grown cacao reflects the plant's original environment. It does not force the cacao tree into unfamiliar conditions. Instead, it recreates the setting in which the species developed, allowing its natural traits to function as intended. The dependence on biodiversity explains why cacao farming is closely tied to local knowledge. Farmers observe how trees respond over years and adjust practices accordingly. There is no single formula. Each site develops its own balance based on climate, soil, and surrounding vegetation. Biodiversity also supports the long life of cacao trees. Reduced stress, improved soil, and moderated climate conditions allow trees to remain productive for decades. This longevity benefits both farmers and ecosystems by reducing the need for frequent replanting. Shade farming does not remove human involvement. It requires careful observation and ongoing adjustment. However, it works with the plant's natural tendencies rather than against them. This alignment reduces conflict between productivity and plant health. The cacao plant's reliance on biodiversity shows that its success is shared. It does not thrive in isolation. Its productivity depends on insects, soil organisms, companion plants, and climate working together. By maintaining shade and diversity, farmers support not just cacao production, but the systems that make it possible. This approach reflects an understanding that long-term stability matters more than short-lived gains. Biodiversity and shade farming therefore form a foundation for resilient cacao cultivation. They reduce stress, limit disease, and support steady production. These practices allow the cacao plant to continue its slow, dependable growth within an environment that mirrors its origins. Cacao plants produce natural chemical compounds as part of their defense against pests and environmental stress. These compounds are present in the leaves, bark, and seeds, where they discourage insects and other organisms from feeding on the plant. They act by creating bitterness and astringency, making the plant less appealing to consume. This defensive chemistry develops gradually as the plant grows and remains active throughout the life of the tree. The bitterness found in cacao beans originates largely from these natural defense compounds. When seeds are fresh, before any processing, their taste is sharp and unpleasant. This bitterness is not accidental. It protects the seeds from being eaten before they are fully developed and dispersed. The plant invests energy into producing these compounds because losing seeds would interrupt its reproductive cycle. Among the most important substances produced by cacao plants are those that later influence flavor. These compounds interact with proteins and other molecules inside the seed, creating complex chemical structures. While initially defensive, they become the foundation for flavor development once fermentation and drying alter their form. The cacao plant produces them for protection, but they later serve a different role. Cacao beans are also rich in naturally occurring fats. These fats are stored within the seeds and make up a significant portion of their internal structure. Over time, these fats accumulate as the pod develops, providing energy reserves for the seed. When processed, these fats are extracted and known as cocoa butter. Cocoa butter has a unique physical property. It melts at a temperature close to human body temperature. This melting point is not engineered. It results from the specific structure of the fats produced by the cacao plant. When solid at room temperature and liquid when warmed slightly, cocoa butter creates the smooth texture associated with chocolate. The presence of cocoa butter also influences how flavors are released. As the fat melts, it carries aromatic compounds across the palate. This physical behavior links the plant's biology directly to sensory experience. The cacao plant's fat composition therefore shapes texture as much as taste. Cacao plants also produce polyphenols, another group of compounds involved in defense. Polyphenols help protect plant tissues from stress, such as ultraviolet light and pathogens. In cacao beans, they contribute significantly to bitterness and astringency. Fresh beans contain high levels of these compounds. These are gradually reduced through processing. Polyphenols interact with other compounds during fermentation. Heat and microbial activity alter their structure, softening harsh flavors and creating new flavor precursors. The balance between remaining polyphenols and transformed compounds determines how bitter or mild the final product becomes. Processing choices strongly influence how much bitterness remains. Short fermentation or improper drying preserves more defensive compounds, leading to sharper flavors. Longer Well-managed processing reduces bitterness and increases complexity. The plant provides the raw chemistry, but handling determines how it is expressed. The cacao plant does not adjust these compounds based on human preference. Its priority is survival. Bitter chemistry protects seeds from insects and animals in the forest. Humans later adapt processing methods to work with these defenses rather than eliminate them entirely. Older cacao trees often produce seeds with more complex chemistry. Over time, the plant's defensive systems stabilize and the balance of compounds can shift. This contributes to differences in flavor associated with tree age. Younger trees may produce simpler profiles, while older trees show greater variation. Environmental conditions also influence defensive chemistry. Stress can increase compound production, intensifying bitterness. Stable conditions support balance. This explains why farming practices that reduce stress often produce more consistent results. The relationship between defense and flavor illustrates a broader pattern in cacao. Many qualities valued later originate as protective measures. Bitterness discourages predators. Fat stores energy. Polyphenols shield tissues. Processing reshapes these traits, but does not remove their origin. Cacao plants cannot be rushed to change this chemistry. Rapid growth or aggressive farming often increases stress, leading to harsher flavors. Slow growth under stable conditions allows compounds to develop evenly and respond predictably to fermentation. Understanding natural defenses explains why cacao requires careful handling. The plant's chemistry is powerful but sensitive. Processing must respect these compounds rather than overwhelm them. The cacao plant's bitterness is therefore not a flaw to be erased. It is a signal of the plant's long evolutionary history. Humans learned to work with this bitterness, transforming it through time and technique. Natural defenses shape every seed produced by the cacao plant. They protect, preserve, and define potential. From pest deterrence to melting texture, these traits link the living tree to the final experience. The cacao plant produces chemistry for survival, not indulgence. Yet through careful processing, those same compounds become sources of richness and depth. This transformation depends on understanding where bitterness comes from and how it can be guided rather than forced. The defensive nature of cacao chemistry remains present even after processing. It gives structure to flavor and ensures that chocolate retains character rather than becoming flat. The plant's natural defenses continue to influence quality long after harvest. These defensive compounds also influence how cacao responds during later processing stages. As heat is applied and structures melt, fats interact with remaining polyphenols and aromatic molecules, shaping release and persistence of flavor. When bitterness is balanced rather than removed, it provides contrast and length rather than harshness. This balance reflects the original chemistry of the seed, adjusted but not erased. Stress, growth rate, and tree age all leave traces within this chemistry. This processing can guide, but not rewrite. The cacao plant therefore sets boundaries on what flavor can become. Human techniques operate inside those boundaries, refining expression rather than inventing it. By respecting the plant's natural defenses, processing preserves depth, stability, and character across batches and over time. This continuity allows producers to achieve consistency without stripping individuality, since each harvest still carries subtle variation shaped by environment, care, and timing, while remaining recognizably cacao in structure, texture, and flavor. These limits protect identity and prevent processing from overwhelming the biological foundations set by the living tree over many seasons. The texture of chocolate begins with how cacao behaves at the level of fats and solids inside the seed. One of the most distinctive features comes from cocoa butter, the natural fat stored within cacao beans. Cocoa butter remains solid at typical room temperatures, but melts close to human body temperature. This narrow melting range is what allows chocolate to feel firm when held and then soften smoothly once it is in the mouth. The plant produces this fat as an energy reserve, but its physical behavior later defines texture. When cocoa butter melts, it changes state quickly rather than gradually. This creates a clean transition from solid to liquid. As the fat melts, it coats the tongue and mouth evenly, allowing flavor compounds to spread without resistance. This behavior contributes to what is often described as smoothness or creaminess, but it originates from the specific crystalline structure of the fat rather than from added ingredients. The way cocoa butter interacts with solid particles also matters. Finely ground cacao solids are suspended within the fat, and the balance between fat content and particle size determines how chocolate feels as it melts. Too little fat leaves a dry or gritty sensation. Adequate fat allows particles to move freely, producing a cohesive texture that feels continuous rather than fragmented. Cacao plants also produce polyphenols. This play a central role in chemistry and flavor. These compounds protect plant tissues from stress, including pests and environmental pressure. In the raw seed, polyphenols contribute strongly to bitterness and astringency. They interact with proteins and saliva, creating a drying sensation that signals defense rather than nourishment. Polyphenols are sensitive to processing. During fermentation, drying, and later roasting, their structure changes. Some are broken down, while others combine with different compounds. This transformation reduces sharp bitterness and allows more complex flavors to emerge. However, polyphenols are not eliminated entirely. Residual polyphenols continue to shape flavor and mouthfeel, contributing depth and structure. The link between polyphenols and bitterness explains why processing choices matter so much. Short or poorly managed processing leaves higher levels of intact polyphenols, resulting in harsher flavors. Extended, controlled processing reduces their impact without removing them completely. The goal is balance rather than removal, allowing bitterness to support flavor rather than dominate it. Polyphenols also influence texture indirectly. Their interaction with fats and solids affects how flavors are released as chocolate melts. A well-balanced composition allows bitterness to appear gradually, extending flavor rather than overwhelming it. This progression depends on how compounds dissolve and disperse as the fat melts. Processing decisions determine how these chemical relationships are expressed. Grinding reduces particle size, refining texture. Conching redistributes fats and solids, smoothing rough edges. Each step alters how cocoa butter, solids, and remaining polyphenols interact. These actions do not create new chemistry, but they rearrange what the cacao plant has already provided. The cacao plant's chemistry sets boundaries on processing outcomes. Because the fat melts at a specific temperature, texture cannot be altered indefinitely without additives. Because polyphenols are present in certain proportions, bitterness can be softened but not erased without losing character. Processing works within these constraints rather than overriding them. Stress experienced by the plant influences chemistry before processing even begins. Plants grown under stable conditions often produce beans with more predictable balances of fats and polyphenols. Stress can increase defensive compound production, intensifying bitterness and altering texture. Processing can compensate only partially for these differences. This connection explains why identical processing methods can yield different results from different harvests. The chemistry arriving at the processing stage reflects growing conditions, tree age, and handling during fermentation and drying. Texture and flavor emerge from the interaction between plant chemistry and processing technique, rather than from either alone. Cocoa butter also influences how aromas are perceived. As it melts, volatile compounds are released gradually rather than all at once. This slow release allows flavors to unfold over time. Texture therefore affects perception directly, shaping not only how chocolate feels, but how long flavor persists. The stability of cocoa butter contributes to shelf life as well. Its solid state at cooler temperatures protects the chocolate's structure. When improperly handled, cocoa butter can crystallize unevenly, leading to surface bloom. This visual change reflects fat movement rather than spoilage, but it alters texture and appearance. Polyphenols continue to play a role even after processing. They provide structure to flavor, preventing it from becoming flat. Complete removal would create sweetness without depth. Retaining some bitterness maintains contrast and complexity. This processing can refine but not invent. The cacao plant produces chemistry for survival, not for texture or taste. Processing interprets that chemistry. Texture emerges from melting behavior. Flavor develops from transformed compounds. Both remain grounded in the original composition of the seed. Understanding texture and chemistry reveals why careful processing matters. Small changes in time, temperature, or technique can shift balance. Because cacao chemistry is sensitive, precision is required to guide outcomes predictably. The relationship between cacao chemistry and processing is cooperative rather than corrective. Processing does not fix the seed. It reveals what is already present. Texture and flavor depend on how well this relationship is managed. Chocolate's smoothness, bitterness, and persistence therefore trace back to the cacao plant's internal chemistry. Fats determine melting. Polyphenols shape bitterness and structure. Processing aligns these elements into a stable form. This chapter shows that texture is not an added feature. It is an expression of plant biology shaped by human handling. The cacao plant provides the material. Processing arranges it. Together, they produce the physical experience associated with chocolate. Cacao plants grow slowly and respond poorly to attempts to accelerate their development. From early establishment onward, the tree follows a measured pace, shaped by how its tissues form and strengthen over time. Rapid growth can produce visible increases in height or leaf area, but this often occurs before the trunk, branches, and internal transport systems are ready to support long-term production. The cacao plant prioritizes structural stability over speed, building capacity gradually so it can remain productive for decades. Attempts to force faster growth tend to disrupt this balance. Heavy fertilization, aggressive pruning, or excessive exposure to sunlight can push the plant into rapid expansion. While this may increase short-term leaf growth, it often weakens wood density and reduces root development. The plant diverts energy toward visible growth rather than reinforcing the systems that support sustained flowering and pod development. Long-term care produces better flavor than aggressive farming. When cacao trees grow at a steady pace, seed chemistry develops more evenly. Stable growth supports balanced accumulation of fats and defensive compounds. This later respond more predictably during fermentation and drying. Trees pushed into rapid growth often produce beans with harsher or less consistent chemical profiles. Older cacao trees often produce more complex beans. As a tree matures, its growth rate slows further, but its internal systems stabilize. Roots extend into established soil networks, branches strengthen, and flowering becomes more regular. These conditions support subtle variation in seed chemistry, contributing to depth rather than uniform simplicity. Younger trees tend to produce simpler flavor profiles. During early productive years, much of the plant's energy is still allocated to building structure. Bean development occurs alongside continued growth, limiting chemical complexity. As structural demands decrease with age, more resources can be directed consistently toward pod development. Tree care supports this slow transition. Regular pruning is essential to maintain productivity without forcing rapid change. Pruning removes weak, damaged, or crowded branches, improving airflow and light distribution while reducing disease pressure. When done gradually, pruning strengthens remaining growth, rather than triggering excessive new shoots. Pruning also controls tree shape and height. By maintaining a compact, balanced structure, strain on the trunk and main branches is reduced. Resources are distributed more evenly, supporting steady flowering rather than uneven bursts of growth that compete internally for water and nutrients. Improved airflow resulting from proper pruning allows leaves to dry more quickly after rain. This reduces moisture accumulation on surfaces where fungal disease can develop. At the same time, shade is preserved so humidity remains within the range the plant tolerates. These conditions support healthy leaf function without increasing stress. Tree care must be continuous rather than reactive. Removing too much growth at once shocks the plant and slows recovery. Smaller, regular adjustments align with the cacao plant's natural rhythm and allow it to maintain balance between growth, maintenance, and reproduction. Growth speed directly affects how the plant responds to stress. Slowly grown trees with reinforced structures tolerate environmental variation more effectively than trees pushed into rapid expansion. Their tissues recover more reliably, and flowering patterns remain more stable across seasons. Cacao plants recover slowly from damage. Broken branches, trunk wounds, or root disturbance can reduce productivity for years. Careful pruning and handling protect the tree's long-term capacity rather than chasing short-term yield increases. Tree age influences how care is applied. Younger trees require guidance to establish structure. Mature trees require maintenance to preserve balance. In both cases, the goal is stability rather than acceleration. The relationship between growth speed and care explains why cacao farming rewards patience. Immediate gains may be possible, but they often shorten the productive lifespan of the tree. Steady management supports consistent output over many years. Cacao quality reflects this history of care. Beans carry the imprint of growth conditions, pruning practices, and restraint long before harvest. Processing can shape flavor, but it cannot replace years of balanced development. Growth speed and tree care therefore determine both longevity and consistency. When the plant is allowed to grow at its natural pace, internal systems remain aligned, chemistry develops evenly, and productivity is sustained rather than exhausted. The cacao plant is not designed for rapid cycles. Its biology sets limits that care must respect. By working within those limits, farmers support healthier trees and beans shaped by stability rather than haste. Harvesting cacao is a physical process that depends on careful timing and deliberate movement rather than speed. Most cacao harvesting is done by hand because the structure of the tree and the placement of pods do not allow for mechanical removal without damage. Pods grow directly from the trunk and thick branches, and each one must be removed individually. This slow approach reflects how the tree grows and protects its future productivity. Hand harvesting allows workers to judge pod maturity by sight, color, and firmness. Pods that are not fully mature are left on the tree, while ripe pods are selected and removed. This selective process prevents unnecessary strain on the tree and ensures that developing pods are not disturbed. Because cacao trees carry pods at different stages at the same time, harvesting is spread out rather than concentrated into a single event. Careful harvesting also protects the tree's flowering sites. New flowers often emerge from the same areas of the trunk where pods were previously attached. Damaging these areas during harvest can reduce future pod formation. Hand tools allow precise cuts that separate the pod without tearing bark or bruising the underlying wood. Most cacao harvesting tools are simple. Machetes or knives are used to cut pods free, with the blade placed close to the stem that connects the pod to the tree. The cut must be clean and controlled. A careless strike can slice into the trunk or branch, leaving wounds that take time to heal and may invite disease. Damaged trunks reduce future production. Because cacao trees grow slowly, injuries persist longer than they would in fast-growing crops. A cut that penetrates too deeply can interfere with internal transport systems that move water and nutrients through the tree. Over time, repeated damage reduces flowering and pod development. Harvesting practices are therefore designed to minimize harm. Workers are trained to approach the tree carefully, position tools accurately, and remove pods without twisting or pulling. Pods are supported as they are cut free so their weight does not tear tissue as they fall. Because harvesting is done by hand, it is labor-intensive. Each pod represents a separate action. This labor requirement ties cacao production closely to human skill and attention, rather than machinery. Speed is limited by what can be done safely without harming the tree. The timing of harvest affects final chocolate flavor. Pods harvested too early contain seeds that have not fully developed. Pods left too long may over-ripen, increasing the risk of internal spoilage. Correct timing ensures that seeds enter fermentation with the proper balance of sugars and internal compounds. Harvesting does not end when pods are removed from the tree. Pods are gathered, transported short distances, and opened carefully to extract seeds. Each step must preserve seed quality while maintaining the health of the tree for future harvests. The reliance on hand harvesting reflects the cacao plant's biology. Its growth form, pod placement, and sensitivity to damage require restraint. Machines cannot easily distinguish between mature and immature pods or avoid injuring flowering sites. Harvesting practices therefore prioritize continuity. The goal is not to extract as much as possible at once, but to keep the tree productive across many seasons. This approach aligns with the cacao plant's slow growth and long life. Over time, skilled harvesting supports consistent yields. Trees that are handled gently recover quickly and continue flowering. Trees that are damaged repeatedly decline in productivity. Harvesting is repeated many times throughout the year, rather than concentrated into a single season. This reflects the staggered development of pods and allows the tree to maintain balance. The physical act of cutting pods connects the grower directly to the plant's structure. Each cut is informed by experience and observation. Harvesting practices therefore shape not only yield, but longevity. They determine how well the cacao plant continues its work after each pod is removed. Cacao shaped ancient cultures across Central and South America long before it became a global commodity. Archaeological evidence shows cacao was cultivated, prepared, and consumed thousands of years ago. Early societies valued the plant for its stimulating properties and for the labor required to produce it. Cacao was first consumed as a drink rather than as a solid food. Seeds were fermented, dried, roasted, and ground, then mixed with water and spices. This beverage was often bitter and frothy, reflecting the plant's natural chemistry. Preparation required time and skill. This added to its cultural importance. Cacao influenced trade, currency, and ritual within these societies. In some regions, cacao seeds were used as units of exchange. Their value depended on freshness, size, and condition, linking agriculture to commerce. Ritual use placed cacao at the center of ceremonies, marking status, trade, and belief. Its preparation and consumption followed specific rules that reinforced social structure. Cacao farming and use spread globally through colonial trade routes. Plants were transported to new regions, where growing conditions determined success. This movement reshaped local agriculture and connected distant markets. Over time, cacao became embedded in economies far from its original forests. Today, most cacao is grown by smallholder farmers rather than large industrial estates. These farmers manage small plots and rely on careful labor throughout the year. Their daily work ties local landscapes to global consumption patterns. The cultural history of cacao remains present in modern production systems. Traditional knowledge guides, harvesting, fermentation, and drying practices passed across generations. This continuity links ancient use with contemporary supply chains. Cacao therefore connects people across time through shared reliance on the same plant. Its cultural origins continue to influence how the crop is valued and protected. Understanding this history explains why production remains labor-intensive and locally rooted. The plant's journey from forest drink to global ingredient was gradual and uneven. Each stage depended on movement of plants, techniques, and people. Cacao's spread did not erase its origins, but layered new meanings onto them. Those layers continue to shape how cacao is grown and exchanged today. The crop's past remains visible in farming choices and market structures. Cultural origins therefore remain inseparable from modern cacao production. They explain patterns of ownership, labor, and value distribution. From ancient drinks to present-day markets, the same plant underlies continuity. Cacao's role evolved, but its dependence on careful cultivation did not. This dependence anchors history within the physical life of the tree. Cultural practices grew from biological constraints rather than replacing them. The result is a crop whose past and present remain tightly connected. This connection continues to shape decisions made in fields and markets. Cacao's cultural origins therefore form part of its ongoing production story. They remain active influences rather than distant history. Farmers today operate within frameworks shaped by centuries of use and exchange. These frameworks affect pricing, labor expectations, and land management. Cacao's movement through history links local effort to global demand. that link remains grounded in the same biological requirements. The plant continues to shape culture by setting limits and possibilities. Its cultivation reflects accumulated knowledge rather than sudden invention. Cacao's past, therefore, remains present in every harvest. The continuity of practice connects ancient use to modern supply. This continuity explains why the crop resists full industrial simplification. Cacao production depends on people, place, and time. Cacao's movement from ritual plant to traded commodity reshaped how it was grown, exchanged, and valued. Once cacao began circulating beyond local communities, production had to adapt to sustained demand rather than occasional ceremonial use. This shift placed new emphasis on consistency, storage, and transport. Techniques that had developed for local preparation were adjusted to support wider exchange, while cultivation expanded into regions that could support reliable output. As cacao entered trade networks, systems emerged to standardize its value. Beans used as currency required careful handling because damage or spoilage reduced worth. This encouraged attention to drying quality, storage conditions, and selection. The physical characteristics of cacao seeds shaped how they functioned economically. Their size, durability, and perishability limited how far they could travel and how long they could be held, influencing trade routes and exchange practices. Labor organization also changed as cacao became more widely traded. Production required coordinated effort across planting, harvesting, fermentation, and drying. These stages could not be rushed or easily mechanized. This tied cacao production to skilled human labor. Communities developed roles and knowledge around these tasks, reinforcing local expertise and dependence on experienced growers. Colonial trade routes expanded cacao cultivation into new regions. Plants were moved to areas with suitable climates, but success depended on matching growing conditions closely to the cacao plant's requirements. Where climate or soil differed, yield suffered. This uneven success shaped global production patterns, concentrating cacao in regions where environmental conditions aligned with the plant's needs. As trade intensified, cacao shifted from a locally managed crop to one embedded in global systems. Markets began to influence how much was grown and where. However, the plant's biology resisted full industrial scaling. Its sensitivity to environment, reliance on manual harvesting, and need for careful fermentation limited the speed and scale of expansion. These constraints contributed to the persistence of smallholder farming. Large plantations struggled to manage cacao efficiently across wide areas, while smaller plots allowed closer attention to individual trees. Smallholders could adjust shade, pruning, and harvesting based on observation rather than uniform schedules. This flexibility improved outcomes within the limits set by the plant. The dominance of smallholder production is therefore not accidental. It reflects the cacao plant's requirements rather than purely economic choice. Managing a few hectares allows growers to respond to subtle changes in weather, disease pressure, and tree condition. These adjustments are difficult to implement across vast monoculture estates without significant loss. Trade structures reinforce this pattern. Buyers sourced cacao from many small producers rather than relying on single large suppliers. This distributed risk and allowed production to continue even when local disruptions occurred. The result was a global supply built from numerous local systems rather than centralized operations. Cacao's role in colonial economies also influenced land use and labor arrangements. In many regions, cacao was integrated into existing agricultural landscapes rather than replacing them entirely. Shade-grown systems aligned with this integration, allowing cacao to coexist with other crops and forest cover. This approach preserved ecological relationships while supporting trade. Over time, these patterns shaped modern supply chains. Processing centers developed far from growing regions, while cultivation remained tied to tropical environments. This separation increased the importance of transport and storage quality. Poor handling at any stage could reduce value, reinforcing the need for skilled local production. Cultural knowledge continued to guide practices even as markets expanded. Techniques for fermentation and drying were refined through experience rather than formal instruction. This knowledge transfer maintained continuity across generations, connecting historical use with modern production. Economic pressure did not remove the plant's biological limits. Demand increased, but yields remained constrained by pollination rates, growth speed, and disease risk. These limits prevented unlimited expansion and kept cacao production labor-intensive. The persistence of smallholder systems also influenced social structures. Families and communities remained central to production, with work distributed across seasons. This continuity reinforced ties between land, labor, and livelihood. Cacao's integration into global trade did not erase its origins. Instead, it layered new economic roles onto existing agricultural practices. The plant remained rooted in environments that matched its needs, while its products traveled far beyond those landscapes. Understanding these structural outcomes explains why cacao production today looks the way it does. Historical movement through trade routes interacted with plant biology to shape enduring patterns. These patterns continue to define who grows cacao, how it is managed, and where value is created. Cacao's cultural history therefore extends beyond ritual and consumption into the organization of production itself. The plant's constraints shape trade, labor, and land use in lasting ways. These influences remain present in modern cacao systems, linking past practices to current realities. Climate shifts place increasing pressure on cacao plants because their tolerance range is narrow and inflexible. Rising temperatures push conditions closer to physiological limits that the plant cannot easily escape. Unlike annual crops, cacao trees cannot be replanted or relocated quickly in response to gradual warming. Trees established decades earlier remain fixed in place, experiencing changes that occur over their productive lifespan rather than between planting cycles. Higher temperatures increase water demand within the plant. Leaves lose moisture more rapidly, and roots must supply additional water to maintain function. When rainfall patterns do not adjust in parallel, stress accumulates. Even small increases in average temperature can alter flowering timing, reduce pollination success, and increase disease pressure. These effects compound over years rather than appearing as isolated events. Climate change also affects shade dynamics. Regions that once provided natural buffering through cloud cover or rainfall may no longer moderate heat as effectively. Shade-grown systems can reduce some impacts, but they cannot fully offset prolonged warming. As conditions shift, the margin between productive growth and chronic stress narrows, placing long-term viability at risk. Climate change threatens cacao production by pushing growing conditions beyond what the plant evolved to tolerate. Rising temperatures increase metabolic stress, forcing cacao trees to operate closer to their physiological limits. Unlike crops that can adjust growth cycles quickly, cacao trees must endure these changes continuously over many years. Heat stress affects photosynthesis efficiency. Enzymes responsible for energy production function best within narrow temperature ranges. As temperatures rise, these processes become less efficient, reducing the energy available for growth, flowering, and pod development. Over time, this lowers overall productivity rather than causing immediate failure. Changes in rainfall patterns further complicate this stress. Some regions experience longer dry periods, while others see heavier, less predictable rainfall. Extended drought reduces flowering and pod set. Excess rain increases fungal disease pressure and interferes with root respiration. Both outcomes reduce yield stability. Cacao plants are especially vulnerable because they depend on consistent conditions rather than extremes. Small shifts in climate variables accumulate over years, weakening trees gradually. This slow decline can be difficult to detect until productivity drops significantly. Rising temperatures also influence pollinator behavior. Midges depend on moist, shaded environments. As heat increases and humidity patterns change, suitable breeding conditions may shrink. Reduced pollinator activity lowers already limited pollination rates, further restricting pod formation. Shade-grown cacao offers partial protection. Shade trees reduce leaf temperature, slow moisture loss, and buffer wind exposure. These systems can delay the onset of heat stress, but cannot eliminate it entirely. Their effectiveness depends on species composition, canopy density, and local climate trends. As climate pressure increases, traditional cacao regions may become less suitable. Some areas will experience declining yields, while others may face increased disease outbreaks. Because cacao takes years to mature, adapting to these changes is slow and costly. Smallholder farmers face particular challenges. Limited resources constrain their ability to replant, relocate, or modify infrastructure quickly. Climate-related losses therefore carry greater economic risk at the household level. Research efforts focus on improving resilience through shade management, soil health, and selective breeding. However, genetic adaptation in cacao is slow, and new varieties must still meet flavor and processing expectations. Solutions develop incrementally rather than rapidly. The future of chocolate depends on the health of the cacao plant itself. Sustaining production requires working within biological limits rather than expecting technological fixes to override them. Climate change narrows those limits, making careful management increasingly important. Long-term viability will depend on maintaining environments that resemble the conditions cacao evolved within. This includes stable temperatures, consistent moisture, and intact ecological relationships. Where those conditions erode, production becomes uncertain. Climate change does not eliminate cacao production immediately. Instead, it introduces growing instability. Yield fluctuations become more common, disease pressure increases, and long-term planning becomes more complex. The cacao plant's future is therefore tied to environmental stability. Protecting that stability supports not only production, but the livelihoods connected to it. As conditions change, the margin for error continues to shrink. Climate pressure also affects the long timelines involved in cacao cultivation. Because trees take several years to reach maturity, decisions made today must account for conditions that may not fully emerge for decades. A tree planted under current conditions may face a different climate during its most productive years. This delay limits the ability of farmers to respond quickly to environmental change and increases uncertainty in long-term planning. Rising temperatures can also accelerate soil moisture loss, even in shaded systems. As evaporation increases, soils dry more quickly between rainfall events. This places additional stress on shallow root systems and reduces nutrient uptake. Over time, repeated moisture stress weakens trees and reduces their capacity to recover from disease or physical damage. Changes in rainfall timing further complicate management. Rain that arrives in heavier bursts rather than steady patterns can overwhelm drainage systems and increase erosion. Valuable topsoil may be lost, reducing fertility and disrupting microbial communities that support root health. These effects accumulate gradually and are difficult to reverse. Pollination pressure increases under climate stress. As suitable habitat for midges shrinks, pollination success may decline further. Because cacao already operates with low pollination rates, even small reductions can noticeably impact pod formation. This compounds yield loss beyond what heat or drought alone would cause. Shade management becomes more complex under changing conditions. Farmers must balance protection from heat with sufficient light for photosynthesis. As climates warm, optimal shade levels may shift, requiring adjustments to canopy structure. These changes take time to implement and carry risks if misjudged. Climate change also influences disease dynamics. Warmer, wetter conditions in some regions may favor fungal growth, while drier conditions in others may stress trees and lower resistance. Disease patterns may become less predictable, increasing management difficulty. Economic pressure rises alongside environmental stress. Reduced yields increase vulnerability for smallholder farmers who depend on cacao income. Limited financial reserves constrain their ability to adapt through replanting, infrastructure changes, or diversification. The future of cacao production therefore depends on maintaining resilience rather than maximizing output. Strategies that support soil health, biodiversity, and shade may not eliminate climate impacts, but they can slow decline and reduce volatility. Adaptation is gradual rather than immediate. Incremental adjustments accumulate over time, improving tolerance, but not guaranteeing stability. The cacao plant's biology sets firm boundaries on how far adaptation can go. As climate conditions continue to shift, some regions may become marginal for cacao production. Others may remain viable with careful management. This uneven impact reshapes global supply rather than eliminating it outright. The future of chocolate remains closely tied to the cacao plant's ability to endure change. Its survival depends on working within biological limits, while reducing stress where possible. Cacao plants link soil, insects, climate, and people into a single working system, rather than a set of independent parts. Each element influences the others continuously. Soil conditions affect root health. Root health affects flowering and pod development. Flowering depends on insect activity. Insect activity depends on moisture, shade, and organic matter. Human labor interacts with every stage, shaping outcomes without replacing these relationships. The soil beneath a cacao tree is not just a support structure. It is a living layer where roots, fungi, bacteria, and organic matter interact. Nutrients are released gradually as plant material decomposes. Microorganisms convert this material into forms roots can absorb. When soil is healthy, cacao roots maintain steady access to water and nutrients. When soil degrades, the entire system weakens, even if above-ground growth initially appears unchanged. Insects play a similarly integrated role. Pollinating midges depend on damp, shaded ground where organic matter accumulates. That same ground supports soil organisms that improve fertility. When leaf litter is removed or soil dries out, midge populations decline. Reduced pollination then limits pod formation. This shows how changes at ground level affect outcomes on the trunk months later. Climate acts as the background condition that shapes all other interactions. Temperature influences evaporation, insect behavior, and microbial activity. Rainfall patterns determine soil moisture and disease pressure. Shade moderates these effects but does not remove them. Small shifts in climate ripple through the system, altering balances rather than acting in isolation. Human activity enters this system through management rather than control. Farmers influence shade density, pruning patterns, harvesting timing, and fermentation practices. These actions guide outcomes, but they do not override biological limits. Successful management aligns with existing processes instead of attempting to replace them. Every chocolate bar reflects months of plant growth shaped by these interactions. The final product carries the imprint of soil conditions, pollination success, weather patterns, and human decisions made across seasons. No single stage determines quality on its own. Each stage depends on what came before and constrains what comes after. This interconnectedness explains why cacao farming rewards patience more than speed. Rapid intervention often disrupts balance. Removing shade too quickly dries soil and reduces insect activity. Forcing yields through heavy inputs stresses roots and weakens defenses. These actions may produce short-term gains, but destabilize the system over time. The cacao plant cannot be rushed without losing quality. Its growth rate, flowering pattern, and pod development are fixed by physiology. Attempts to compress timelines usually shift stress rather than eliminate it. The system absorbs that stress until a threshold is reached, then productivity declines. Cacao trees are quiet contributors to daily comfort. They operate far from consumption sites, growing slowly in environments that demand care. Their work is mostly invisible to the people who benefit from it. Yet each step in their growth connects directly to later experiences of flavor and texture. The plant itself is fragile despite its cultural and economic importance. It depends on narrow environmental conditions and specific ecological relationships. This fragility requires systems that support resilience rather than extraction. When systems are simplified, vulnerability increases. Chocolate begins long before factories and recipes. It starts with soil structure, insect life, and climate stability. These factors set the ceiling for what processing can achieve. No amount of refinement can fully compensate for breakdowns earlier in the system. The cacao flower few people ever notice represents a convergence of these elements. Its appearance depends on sustained plant health. Its pollination depends on insect presence. Its success depends on climate conditions during a brief window. When all align, a pod begins to form. Each cacao pod represents a rare, successful pollination embedded within a larger system. That pod carries seeds shaped by months of resource allocation. Those seeds then move through fermentation, drying and processing, carrying forward the effects of earlier conditions. Systems thinking explains why cacao production varies so widely between regions and years. Differences in soil management, shade structure, climate patterns, and labor practices combine to produce distinct outcomes. These differences persist, even when varieties and processing methods are similar. People are part of this system, not external to it. Labor decisions influence soil cover, shade balance, and harvest timing. Economic pressure can push systems toward instability, while long-term planning can support balance. Human choices interact with biological processes continuously. Understanding cacao as a system clarifies why isolated fixes often fail. Improving one element without supporting others shifts pressure rather than resolving it. Increasing yields without maintaining soil health reduces future capacity. Expanding cultivation without supporting insect habitat lowers pollination success. The strength of cacao production lies in alignment. When soil, insects, climate, and management reinforce each other, the system remains productive. When they work at cross purposes, decline follows gradually but persistently. This system's connection also explains why adaptation is slow. Each component responds at its own pace. Soil health recovers over years. Tree structure changes gradually. Insect populations adjust seasonally. Climate trends unfold over decades. Coordination across these timelines requires restraint. Cacao's dependence on systems contrasts with crops designed for rapid cycles. It cannot be treated as a short-term commodity without consequence. Its biology enforces continuity, linking past conditions to present outcomes. The cacao plant's life therefore connects many layers of interaction. From underground roots to canopy shade, from insects to global markets, its productivity reflects cooperation across scales. This cooperation is not automatic. It must be maintained. Every piece of chocolate traces back to this slow, careful system. The plant's contribution is steady rather than dramatic. Its value emerges from consistency rather than volume. By recognizing these connections, it becomes clear why cacao production remains complex and labor-intensive. Simplicity reduces resilience. Systems preserve it. This chapter shows that cacao cannot be understood by isolating stages. Growth, harvest, processing, and consumption remain linked. Each stage carries forward the consequences of the system that produced it. Cacao's future depends on maintaining these connections. When soil health, insect life, climate moderation, and careful management remain aligned, the system continues to function. When they separate, quality and stability erode. The cacao plant endures by operating within a network rather than standing alone. That network sustains its slow work and allows its contribution to persist quietly across time. Cacao trees are fragile despite the scale of their cultural and economic presence. The plant depends on a narrow set of conditions and produces few opportunities for success at each stage of its life cycle. Pollination is rare, pod development is slow, and trees respond poorly to stress. These limitations are not incidental. They are built into how the plant survives in forest environments and cannot be removed without consequence. Chocolate begins long before factories and recipes because the cacao plant completes most of its work before harvest ever occurs. Years of growth establish roots, trunks, and branches. Flowers appear only once the tree is mature enough to support them. Pollination depends on chance encounters with tiny insects. Each of these steps limits how many pods can exist at one time. The cacao flower, few people ever notice, reflects this fragility. Thousands of flowers may open on a single tree, yet only a small number will become pods. This imbalance protects the plant from overextension. It allows the tree to discard failed attempts quickly and commit resources only to rare successes. The abundance of flowers does not signal abundance of fruit. Each cacao pod represents a rare, successful pollination rather than routine output. A pod begins because multiple conditions aligned briefly. The flower opened at the right moment. A pollinator was present. Environmental stress remained low enough to allow early development. The tree then supported that pod for months without interruption. When a pod is visible on the trunk, it reflects the survival of many earlier failures. The plant itself remains vulnerable even after pods form. Disease, drought, excess rain, or physical damage can end development before maturity. Because cacao trees do not produce large numbers of pods, losses are proportionally significant. The system depends on protecting what little the tree is able to produce. Every piece of chocolate traces back to the slow, careful life of the cacao plant. Behind each bar are years of growth and months of monitoring. The final product reflects not just processing skill, but the absence of severe disruption during the plant's development. Stability matters more than force. Cacao trees are quiet contributors to daily comfort. They grow far from places of consumption, producing seeds that will eventually be transformed elsewhere. Their work is invisible, yet their limitations shape availability, cost, and quality. The plant does not respond to urgency. It continues at its own pace regardless of demand. The fragility of the cacao plant explains why production cannot simply scale without consequences. Increasing planting density, reducing shade, or accelerating growth often leads to higher stress and lower long-term output. These interventions appear effective briefly, then undermine the system that supports them. Chocolate therefore depends on restraint as much as effort. The plant cannot be rushed without losing quality. Attempts to override its biology shift pressure rather than remove it. The resulting instability appears later as disease, yield loss, or inconsistent flavor. Cacao farming rewards patience because patience aligns with the plant's natural limits. Trees maintained under stable conditions remain productive longer. Their rare pods develop fully. Their seeds accumulate chemistry evenly. These outcomes depend on time rather than intervention. The plant's fragility also explains why cacao production remains labor-intensive. Machines cannot replace observation, timing, and restraint. Each pod must be protected individually. Each cut must preserve future flowering sites. Human involvement remains necessary because the plant does not tolerate blunt efficiency. The cacao tree's contribution is therefore defined by limits. It produces little, slowly, and under specific conditions. Yet within those limits, it produces something of enduring value. The contrast between fragility and significance defines the crop. Rarity shapes perception. Because pods are uncommon, they are treated carefully. Because success is uncertain, losses matter. This dynamic reinforces attention throughout the system. From tree care to processing, care compensates for scarcity. The closing perspective on cacao is not about abundance, but continuity. The plant has survived because it fits into environments that support it, and because people learn to work within its constraints. When those constraints are ignored, production falters. Toward the end of the cacao plant's cycle, activity slows rather than accelerates. Pods mature at their own pace. Seeds complete development gradually. There is no final surge of growth. The plant settles into completion quietly. In these final stages, the cacao tree continues its steady exchange with the environment. Leaves draw light. Roots absorb water. The pod remains attached, unchanged from day to day. This stability allows seeds to finish developing without disturbance. The plant does not signal when completion is near. Maturity arrives through consistency rather than climax. When harvest occurs, it interrupts a process that would otherwise continue calmly. This quiet ending reflects the entire life of the cacao plant. Growth begins slowly, proceeds carefully, and concludes without drama. The plant does not mark milestones. It simply maintains function until change is required. The rarity of success and the fragility of conditions define cacao's value more than scale ever could. Each successful pod represents alignment rather than force. Each bean carries the history of that alignment forward. Thank you for listening to the Sleepy Mind channel. I hope you have enjoyed spending time learning about the cacao plant.